Before the cities, before the kings and empires, before even the wheel or the written word, there was a quiet moment when everything changed. Picture it, the stars shimmering above a sleeping camp, nestled beside a slow-moving river. The crackle of embers, the hush of wind over tall grass. This is where our story begins, in a world untouched by farms or fences, where humans roamed freely, following the rhythms of nature. Welcome to the historian's tome. Tonight, you're invited to drift gently into sleep as we journey through the entire story of the agricultural revolution, the most transformative era in all of human history. Around 12,000 years ago, scattered across distant lands, our ancestors made a choice. Or perhaps the world made it for them. They began to settle, to plant, to stay. But why? Why would people who had survived for hundreds of thousands of years as hunters and gatherers suddenly trade freedom for fields and wandering for work? Over the next 6 chapters, we'll explore this ancient mystery, from the final days of the foragers, to the first seeds sown in forgotten soil, to the rise of villages, cities, and civilizations. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let's begin the long, slow dawn of everything. Long before the first seed was planted, there was the open world. No fields, no borders, just endless landscapes stretching beneath the stars. Forests, rivers, valleys, and mountains. This was the realm of the hunter-gatherers, and for nearly 99% of human history, it was the only world we knew. In small bands of 20, maybe 30 people, our ancestors wandered the land. They moved with the seasons, following herds and ripening berries, living by the rhythm of the earth rather than the rules of a clock. They built no houses, left few ruins, and carried their lives on their backs. They were masters of adaptability. With simple stone tools, flaked from obsidian or flint, they crafted spears, axes, and knives. With fire, they cooked, kept warm, and lit the dark. At night, they gathered around flickering flames, telling stories, singing songs, passing down wisdom without ever writing a word. Their lives were rooted in cooperation. Survival meant sharing, food, tools, tasks, and dangers. There were no kings, no landlords, no armies. Decisions were often made together, and status depended more on age or experience than ownership. There were clear advantages to this way of life. Their diets were varied: nuts, fruits, roots, fish, meat, depending on what the land provided. Mobility protected them from local famines or threats. If resources ran low, they simply moved on. Their social world was flexible, less burdened by hierarchy, more fluid, more free. But it wasn't idyllic. The life of a forager was never guaranteed. A bad season could mean hunger. A failed hunt could bring hardship. There were no storehouses to rely on, no granaries filled with grain. Nature gave and nature took away. Injuries that today would be minor, a cut, a broken bone, an infected wound, could end a life. And though they left behind few monuments, they left behind many graves. Their tools were sharp, but their control over the environment was still fragile. Fires could be kindled, but storms could not be stopped. And yet, over time, something began to shift. Perhaps it began with a single observation, barely noticed, half remembered. A woman scatters seeds by accident near her camp, and months later returns to find plants growing. A man sees that after burning a forest patch, new grasses spring up stronger than before. Children notice that animals keep returning to the same valleys, year after year. Slowly across countless generations, humans began to notice patterns in nature, cycles in the stars, in plants, in herds. Certain wild grains seemed to favor disturbed ground. Certain animals seemed less afraid of humans. It was not yet farming, but it was a beginning. Perhaps people started tending wild patches, weeding them, returning to harvest the best. Perhaps they learned to drive animals into enclosures or water them during dry seasons. Perhaps they began to shape the land without fully realizing they were doing so. This was not a sudden leap. There was no moment when a forager woke up and decided to invent agriculture. It was a slow unfolding. A quiet revolution of observation, intuition, and tiny experiments repeated over generations. And as the Ice Age ended and the world warmed, some of those experiments began to take root, quite literally. In the hills of the Fertile Crescent, on the banks of the Yangtze, in the highlands of Peru, people began to stay. The days of wandering weren't over yet, but they were beginning to fade. The rhythm of life was changing, from the open paths of the wild to the first quiet clearings of cultivated ground. The age of the plow was still to come, but the seeds of everything, cities, language, civilization itself, had already been planted. The world was warming. Around 110,000 BCE, the last ice age began to loosen its grip. Glaciers that had once blanketed much of the planet slowly retreated. Forests crept northward. Rivers swelled with meltwater. Grasslands expanded where once there had been frost and snow. For the humans who had roamed through the cold centuries, this changing climate brought both opportunity and uncertainty. The great herds of reindeer and mammoth that had once roamed the open tundra began to vanish. In their place, new animals and plants began to thrive. The world was entering a new phase, and human life began to shift with it. In several corners of the earth, scattered peoples began to notice something remarkable. Certain wild grasses grew especially well in disturbed soils. Some produced seeds that were larger, easier to grind, more nourishing. Over time, people began to favor these plants. They returned to the same patches year after year, scattering seeds more intentionally, weeding the unwanted growth, guarding their harvest from birds and animals. This was not yet full-scale agriculture, but the first hints of it were taking root. The world was becoming a garden of many kinds, tended in different ways across different lands. In the Fertile Crescent, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, early people began to cultivate wheat, barley, and lentils. These hardy grains could be stored, ground, baked, and boiled. Fields that once hosted wild grasses became organized plots. Nearby, figs, olives, and dates also became part of the diet. Far to the east, in the valleys of the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers, farmers in ancient China began planting millet in the north and rice in the south. Rice paddies flourished in the wet, warm climate, requiring cooperation and planning. Millet, drought-resistant and adaptable, supported settlements across the dry plains. Across the ocean in Mesoamerica, long before the Great Pyramids of the Maya or Aztecs were even imagined, early peoples began tending maize, squash, and beans. These three crops, known as the Three Sisters, would come to sustain entire civilizations. But in the beginning, they were fragile plants, nurtured and shaped by generations of care. In the highlands of the Andes, ancient farmers worked with very different crops. The soils were rocky, the climate harsh, but they managed to domesticate the potato, a root vegetable rich in energy, and quinoa, a protein-rich grain still eaten today. Using terraces carved into the mountainsides, they learned to tame the steep terrain. In sub-Saharan Africa, people began to cultivate sorghum, millet, and yams, adapting to a wide range of ecosystems from the Sahel to the forests of the Congo Basin. These crops could survive heat and drought, making them essential in regions with unpredictable rains. Even in Papua New Guinea, isolated by mountains and sea, early agriculturalists learned to grow bananas, sugarcane, and taro, digging irrigation channels and nurturing small garden plots deep in the rainforest. In all these places, domestication was an act of patience. Wild plants did not change overnight. Over many generations, humans selected seeds from the strongest, tastiest, or easiest to harvest specimens. Bit by bit, the plants responded. They grew larger, more dependable, less wild. Some even lost their natural ability to scatter seeds, becoming reliant on humans to reproduce. And plants were not the only living things to be reshaped. The first animal companion to join human life was the Diamantong. Descended from wolves, dogs were likely drawn to human campsites by scraps and warmth. Over time, a bond formed. Dogs helped with hunting, guarded sleeping camps, and became early partners in the human journey. Later came the herds. In the hills of the Fertile Crescent and surrounding regions, people began to domesticate sheep, goats, and cattle. These animals provided meat, milk, hides, and dung for fuel. With them came responsibility. They needed food, protection, and space to graze. In return, they made life more secure. As people grew more invested in the land, the world began to tilt toward permanence. Campsites became seasonal settlements. Seasonal settlements became year-round villages. With planting came the need for harvest. With harvest came storage. With storage came planning. And with planning came the first glimpses of a very different kind of life. It was a life rooted in place, a life where generations could build on the efforts of those who came before, a life of patience, discipline, and cooperation. The wandering age was giving way to something new. The seeds had been planted, and from them a new chapter of humanity was about to bloom. As the first seeds were planted and early harvest gathered, something fundamental began to change in human life. For countless generations, people had followed the food, moving as the seasons turned and the wild offered its gifts. But now the food was staying in one place, and so were the people. The world was entering a new era. Camps once used only during harvest became familiar return points. Return points turned into seasonal homes. Eventually, some groups stopped moving altogether. They built permanent shelters from mud brick, stone, and timber. Fires that once flickered in open clearings now glowed inside warm, protected rooms. These were the first villages, and with them came the earliest sense of something we now call home. One of the oldest known settlements is Jericho, located near the Jordan River in the Levant. By around 9000 BCE, Jericho had already grown into something more than a temporary camp. It had stone walls built to protect people and stored food. It had a tower, possibly for defense or ritual. Within its walls, people lived in circular houses with plastered floors, gathering water from nearby springs and burying their dead beneath their homes. Thousands of miles away, in what is now Turkey, another early settlement was rising. Çatalhöyük was a dense cluster of mud brick homes packed tightly together. There were no streets. People moved across the rooftops, using ladders to enter their homes through holes in the ceiling. Inside, each dwelling had a hearth for cooking, platforms for sleeping, and decorated walls painted with animals and symbols. The people of Çatalhöyük shared space, food, and customs, but they also displayed the first signs of individuality. Some homes were larger, some were filled with more elaborate objects. In these early villages, life took on a new rhythm. Storage became essential. Grain was kept in clay bins or woven baskets. Surplus food allowed people to survive lean seasons and support growing families. More food meant more children could be fed. Over time, populations grew. With growth came complexity. In a nomadic group, belongings were few and shared. But in a settled home, objects accumulated. Tools, baskets, pottery, clothing, charms. People began to claim spaces as their own. Fields were passed from parents to children. The idea of property was beginning to form. So too were ideas of territory. Villages needed land to farm and water to drink. As neighboring groups expanded, disputes arose. Boundaries were marked, not with fences, but with memory, stories, and warnings. Kinship, once fluid and adaptable, began to take new shapes. As generations lived and died in the same place, family lines and ancestry became important. The dead were honored, sometimes buried under floors or clustered in sacred areas. The living carried on their names and tools. Perhaps most importantly, not everyone farmed. With food surpluses, some people began to specialize. There were potters, builders, weavers, and toolmakers. Over time, differences in labor led to differences in power. Some people managed the storage. Some led rituals. Some decided when and where to plant. Control over food became control over people. Inequality did not appear overnight, but its seeds were sown in these early villages. Those who held grain could demand labor or loyalty. Those who oversaw rituals could claim divine favor. Hierarchies that once had little place in nomadic life began to shape the structure of settled communities. Yet still, in many of these early villages, cooperation remained essential. Neighbors helped build walls and raise roofs. They gathered for feasts, mourned the dead together, and passed down stories beside the fire. The world was still small, and life was still vulnerable. But for the first time, people were creating spaces that endured beyond a single lifetime. The village was more than a collection of homes. It was a memory made solid, a place rooted in the soil, a beginning. From here, the foundations of civilization would rise. Fields would stretch wider. Homes would grow into districts. Storage rooms would become temples. The quiet pulse of village life was now the heartbeat of something greater. The journey from Earth to Empire had begun. With villages growing and harvests becoming more dependable, life in early agricultural societies began to transform. The demands of farming, building, and storing food gave rise to new tools, new skills, and entirely new ways of thinking. At first, stone blades and flint scribblers served the needs of the early farmers, much as they had for hunters before them. But over time, these tools evolved. People crafted sickles with curved edges, perfect for cutting through tall grasses and ripened grain. They used grinding stones to crush seeds into flour, a process that made food easier to cook, store, and digest. In some regions, these stones became central to daily life, worn smooth by years of patient labor. Eventually, the first plows appeared. Pulled by human strength at first, and later by domesticated animals, the plow allowed farmers to turn over larger fields of soil. This made planting more efficient and helped crops grow more evenly. The plow marked a turning point. It tethered people more deeply to the land, making agriculture not only possible but increasingly productive. As tools became more specialized, so did the people who used them. In many early communities, not everyone needed to farm. Some became potters, shaping clay into durable vessels for carrying water and storing grain. Others became weavers, spinning threads from plant fibers or animal hair, and creating textiles for clothing, blankets, and trade. Skilled toolmakers chipped obsidian into razor-sharp blades, traded across long distances for its rarity and value. Craftspeople made beads, pendants, and simple ornaments. With each passing generation, people began to express identity, status, and creativity through the objects they made and wore. This growing web of skills and goods led to one of humanity's oldest habits: trade. Even in the earliest villages, people were exchanging more than just food. They traded ideas, stories, tools, and materials. Obsidian from volcanic regions could be found hundreds of miles away. Shells from the coast made their way inland. Salt, essential for preservation, became a prized item. People traded seeds, textiles, and even dried fish or meat. There was no money yet. Instead, trade followed systems of barter and gift-giving. A bundle of grain might be exchanged for a pot. A piece of obsidian could be worth several hides. These exchanges were not just economic, but social. They built trust, forged alliances, and helped connect distant communities. With increasing complexity came a need to keep track. Who owed what and when? How much grain was stored? Who had delivered their share of the harvest? Out of these questions, the first forms of record-keeping began to emerge. In ancient Mesopotamia, people began using tally sticks, notched bones or pieces of wood, to count and record. Later, they shaped small clay tokens to represent goods. One token might stand for a sheep, another for a basket of grain. These tokens could be placed in clay envelopes and sealed, a primitive form of accounting. Over time, marks were pressed into the clay to represent numbers, names, and quantities. These marks would evolve into proto-writing, the ancestor of cuneiform and other writing systems. The first written words were not poems or prayers, but records, lists of debts, shipments, and inventories. Writing was born not from a desire to tell stories, but from the need to remember what had been traded, harvested, or promised. Across the ancient world, from the river valleys of the Middle East to the highlands of the Andes, the combination of tools, trade, and communication reshaped human life. People were no longer just surviving. They were planning. They were organizing. They were innovating. And as communities became more connected through trade and more efficient through tools, the pace of change began to quicken. What had begun as small villages of mud and reed was now becoming something larger. Invention had found its rhythm. Progress had taken root, and the quiet momentum of the agricultural age was slowly carrying humanity toward the first true cities. The agricultural revolution brought security, surplus, and the promise of stability, but it also carried with it a hidden cost. As people began to settle, cultivate, and build, the human experience began to shift in unexpected and often difficult ways. Compared to the lives of hunter-gatherers, early farmers faced a different set of challenges. In many ways, their health began to decline. Archaeological remains show that after the transition to farming, average height decreased. People became shorter and more fragile, likely due to a diet that was less varied and more reliant on a few starchy crops like wheat or rice. Dental decay increased. Grains, especially when ground into flour and baked, stuck to the teeth and fed bacteria. Cavities, once rare, became common. Bones show signs of malnutrition and repetitive strain, evidence of the hard labor that defined early agricultural life. The shift to sedentary living brought people closer together, not only in cooperation, but also in vulnerability. Waste accumulated near homes. Water sources became contaminated. With more people living in close quarters, diseases spread more easily. Insects and rodents, drawn to stored food, became constant problems. The quiet isolation of forager life gave way to the noise and exposure of the village. As daily work intensified, so did the division of labor. Farming was not a seasonal activity, but a year-round effort. Planting, weeding, harvesting, storing, repairing tools, tending animals, and managing fields left little time for rest. Farming demanded structure and discipline, and with that came new roles and expectations. Gender roles, once more flexible in nomadic life, began to solidify. In many societies, women became more tied to the home and child-rearing, while men took on more of the heavy fieldwork or animal management. Over time, these roles could become rigid. As physical labor and land ownership became sources of status, social power began to shift, often away from those who had once held central roles in forager communities. With permanent settlements and stored food came another new concept: wealth. Grain could be measured, guarded, and accumulated. Land could be claimed, passed down, or taken. Animals could be bred and traded. Some people began to own more than others. They managed the storehouses, oversaw distribution, and made decisions that affected entire communities. This was the beginning of social inequality. While many still worked in the fields or tended the animals, a smaller group began to rise as elites. These individuals or families lived in larger homes, wore finer clothing, and sometimes claimed spiritual or divine authority to justify their position. With wealth came power. With power came the need for protection. In earlier times, there had been little reason to fight over land or food. But now, with granaries full of grain and livestock penned in corrals, stored resources became targets. Neighboring groups might look upon a prosperous village with envy. Disputes over land boundaries or water rights could escalate into violence. To defend their homes and wealth, some communities built walls and fortifications. They created weapons from stone, copper, and bone. They trained warriors and established rules for defense and punishment. The seeds of organized conflict were planted. War did not erupt immediately, nor did inequality appear all at once. These changes happened slowly, over generations. But they were real, and their echoes remain with us today. For all its advancements, the agricultural life came with trade-offs. It brought the bounty of harvest, but also the burden of labor. It gave rise to community, but also to competition. It allowed people to dream of permanence, but introduced new fears of loss and invasion. Still, people chose to stay. They chose to build. The promises of farming, food security, family continuity, the hope of a better life outweighed the risks. From this complex balance of growth and hardship, human society continued to evolve. The village would become the city, the granary would become the temple, the leader would become the king, and the story was far from over. From the first planted seed to the shaping of entire landscapes, agriculture did more than feed people. It built the foundation for everything that would come after. Over time, villages grew into towns, paths became roads, markets appeared where once there were only fields. As surpluses increased, populations rose and networks of trade began to spread across the land. Eventually, the quiet rhythms of farming gave way to the rising heartbeat of civilization. In the southern lands of Mesopotamia, near the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the city of Uruk began to rise. It was one of the first true cities in human history. Inside its walls lived tens of thousands of people. Fields stretched beyond its borders. Inside, massive temples stood above the streets, built not just for shelter, but for worship. Uruk and cities like Sumer marked a turning point. People no longer lived only as farmers, potters, or herders. Now there were administrators, priests, scribes, and rulers. The production of food allowed the rise of entirely new professions, each tied to the growing complexity of urban life. Far to the east, along the Indus River, another great city was taking shape. Mohenjo-Daro had wide streets, sophisticated drainage systems, public baths, and orderly brick buildings. These were not scattered settlements. They were carefully planned, the work of people who had learned to organize life on a larger scale. At the center of these cities stood not only grain stores and workshops, but also temples, and religion became a powerful force in early civilizations. The cycles of planting and harvest were linked to the heavens, and rituals were used to ensure the fertility of the land. Priesthoods emerged, conducting ceremonies, interpreting omens, and managing offerings. Food was still sacred, but now it was tied to a deeper system of belief and order. Surplus gave rise to ritual. Ritual gave rise to power. As cities grew, people created laws to manage disputes and guide behavior. These rules were often carved into stone or clay, visible to all who entered. Kings appeared, many claiming their authority from the gods. They protected the fields, led the armies, and oversaw the construction of temples and canals. Behind their power stood agriculture. Without food, there could be no armies, no temples, no cities. Grain was more than sustenance. It was the base upon which entire states were built. Looking back, the arc is long but clear. From small bands of foragers who followed the seasons to great cities rising along rivers, the agricultural revolution had reshaped humanity. The seed planted in a wild field had become a cornerstone of empire. And yet, even now, the traces remain. We still measure time by harvest. We still settle near rivers. We still share meals to mark celebrations. The structure of our days, our towns, our economies, and even our dreams is rooted in those ancient decisions made thousands of years ago. The fields may fall silent at night. The plows may rest. But in the quiet, the story continues. The soil remembers. The rivers still carry whispers of those who first shaped the earth with care and purpose. Thank you for joining us on this long and gentle journey through time. From wandering forests and wild grasses to temples, trade, and cities, we have followed the path of humanity's greatest transformation. If you are still awake, may you carry with you a deeper sense of connection to the past. If you have already drifted into sleep, let the story continue in your dreams. The agricultural revolution was not only the beginning of farming, it was the beginning of planning, of building, of remembering. It was the first quiet moment when humanity chose to stay and in doing so began to grow. Now, as night settles and the world becomes still, imagine the golden fields of early summer, the soft hush of wind over ripened grain, the warmth of firelight in a stone-built home. You are part of that story. Sleep well, and until next time, may history keep you company in the dark.